Hi, I'm Steve Hendricks. I'm a freelance reporter and author of the book, The Oldest Cure in the World: Adventures in the Art and Science of Fasting. Today I want to tell you about something that's not in the book, and that's the question of whether fasting can reverse long COVID. The answer, I believe, is potentially yes. Fasting does seem able to reverse at least some cases of long COVID. Long COVID is, of course, an enormous problem. The Centers for Disease Control have estimated that nearly 1 in 5 American adults now has or has had long COVID, and it's almost as bad in other countries. As many of us know, long COVID symptoms can include a crushing fatigue, a brain fog that sabotages your thinking, debilitating muscle pain, severely impaired breathing, and much, much more. Conventional medicine has no cure for long COVID, mostly just palliatives, things like massage, physical therapy, counseling, and, of course, pills. All of those therapies have their uses. But the sad fact is that such treatments are just treating the symptoms of the disease. None of them can undo the underlying cause. So the best that medicine has been able to offer people with long COVID is really just the hope that they might be one of the lucky ones whose disease spontaneously slowly goes away over time. But it turns out that there may be more cause for hope. Now, let me emphasize maybe, because at this point, all we have are case reports, not peer-reviewed clinical trials. But those cases suggest that fasting may indeed offer a remedy for long COVID. The cases have emerged from some of the world's foremost fasting centers. These are centers for the practice and research of fasting, which have reported success in reversing, and in some cases, it appears entirely eliminating long COVID. The main centers that have publicized these cases are the Buchinger-Wilhelmi clinics, which are 2 sister clinics, one in Germany and one in Spain. And together, they are the largest fasting complex in the world, having fasted more than 250,000 patients over the past century. Other cases of reversing long COVID have been reported at the True North Health Center, which is the oldest and largest fasting clinic in the United States. True North has fasted about 20,000 patients, I would say, over its nearly 40 years of history. Both Buchinger-Wilhelmi and True North have research arms that have published influential, peer-reviewed studies about fasting, often in collaboration with eminent researchers at institutions like Cornell University, the Mayo Clinic, University of Southern California. So these aren't fly-by-night quack wellness retreats that we're talking about here. I'm going to summarize briefly for you 6 of these cases in which fasting seems to have reversed long COVID. There are links to additional details at my website, stevehendricks.org, and in a couple of the cases, you can even see videos of the patients themselves talking about how their fasting appears to have reversed their long COVID. The first 4 cases are from Buchinger-Wilhelmi, which, I should note, practices a form of fasting sometimes called modified fasting. Now, in modified fasting, you don't fast on just water. Instead, you consume up to 250 calories a day, usually in vegetable broths. There are pros and cons to both modified fasting and water fasting. In general, a water fast, in which you consume 0 calories, only water, seems to reverse disease more quickly than a modified fast does. On the other hand, on a modified fast, the small number of calories that you get each day makes the fast gentler. So modified fasters usually have fewer side effects, like less fatigue, fewer headaches, less nausea. Okay. The first case is that of a 70-year-old retired German headmaster. Months after her initial COVID infection, she still suffered from persistent fatigue, headaches, and the stiff neck. She often ran a high temperature, and even mild exertion, like walking uphill or climbing stairs, made her dizzy and breathless. She lost almost all of her sense of smell, although occasionally, for periods that lasted from, I think it was a few minutes to a couple of hours, she partially regained her smell. But as she explained, she was no longer certain where any particular smell came from because her brain seemed to lack the information to link the smell to its source. She fasted at Buchinger Wilhelmi for 19 days. Over the course of her fast, her breathlessness, fatigue, headaches, stiff neck, and high temperatures gradually went away. And by the end of her fast, she could walk 10 kilometers, 6 miles, without a problem. She also recovered much of her ability to smell, although not all of it, and she could sometimes identify the source of those smells, for example, matching the scent of a lemon to the lemon itself. The second case is that of a young doctor from Geneva. I'm not sure of her exact age, but I think she was probably about in her 30s. Her long COVID took the form of recurring bronchitis and fever, profound fatigue, extreme muscle weakness, and an inability to breathe normally. She had previously loved to exercise, but she was completely unable to do so after her COVID infection, and she slept for up to 14 hours a day. She fasted at Buchinger Wilhelmi for about a week. The first 3 days, she felt no improvement. But on the 4th day, she felt such a surge of energy that she decided to try jogging, and she was stunned to find that she could cover 5 slow kilometers, but still 5 kilometers, 3 miles. During her fast, she also practiced breathing exercises, and eventually her respiratory troubles disappeared, although whether from the fast or the exercises or something else, we don't of course know. But in any event, she felt stronger day by day. And by the end of her week of fasting, she reported feeling essentially back to normal. The third case from Buchinger Wilhelmi is of a 33-year-old dentist who was from London, and her long COVID manifested in extreme fatigue, severe muscle aches, and a debilitating weakness while walking. And also, like the Swiss doctor, she slept for up to 14 hours a day. Hers was a slightly more fortunate case than many people's in that she was still able to work. But after each patient, she had to rest her head on her desk and marshal what little energy she had before she could see the next patient. She described herself as a zombie and said she felt about 20% of her normal self. She fasted at the clinic for 7 days, and by the end of her fast, much of her energy had returned. Her walking had grown stronger, and her muscle aches disappeared. Now, she didn't feel completely cured after fasting for just a week, but she described herself as back to about 80% of her former self. The following year, she went back to the clinic for another fast, and after that one, she described herself as 95% recovered. Our fourth case is that of a 60-year-old wine dealer from Strasbourg. During his initial COVID infection, he lost his senses of smell and taste, and they didn't return after he recovered from the acute infection. Now, in his line of work, not being able to smell or taste was so devastating that he had to take indefinite leave from his job. He also suffered from an enfeebling brain fog that just kept him from thinking clearly or reading even the simplest material. And although he had long loved to play the piano, he completely lost that ability too. Ordinarily, he was also fluent in English and German, but he now had great difficulty expressing himself in either one of those languages, and he could communicate effectively only in his native French. Unlike the first 3 people we heard about, when the wine dealer went to Buchinger Wilhelmi, he didn't do a prolonged fast. Instead, he just ate a very restricted diet of 800 calories a day and practiced a form of time-restricted eating called 16-8 fasting. 16-8 is fasting for 16 hours every day, mostly at night, of course, and taking all your calories in the other 8 hours. Within days, he was surprised to find himself sitting down to the clinic's piano and, for the first time since his infection, playing sonatas by Mozart and Scarlatti, which moved him to tears. The clinic didn't report how many days he stuck with this regimen, but by the end of his stay, he had almost completely regained his senses of smell and taste, his brain fog had started to clear, and he had plans to return to work. So those are some of the cases from Buchinger Wilhelmi. I've also heard multiple accounts of recovery from long COVID among patients who fasted at the True North Health Center in Northern California, and there the fasting is done on nothing but water. Unfortunately, True North hasn't made many details about those cases public because, as I understand, they're submitting some of them for publication in peer-reviewed medical journals. Now, once those studies are accepted, if they're accepted, we'll know much more. But for now, I can mostly only report that the details I've heard so far from True North are consistent with the stories of recovery from Buchinger-Wilhelmi. I can, however, also say that one of the more intriguing of these True North stories is the case of a nurse who had suffered from long COVID, for 2 years. She got little relief from many of the usual treatments, and then she did a water fast at the clinic that lasted 40 days. Nearly all of her symptoms seemed to have disappeared, and her improvement was apparently corroborated by some before and after blood work. Now, if this account proves accurate, it would suggest that longer fasts may be able to help people whose long COVID is of longer standing, people who've had the disease not just for months, but for years. I've also corresponded with a few people who have told me that their long COVID reversed when they fasted. I'll share with you one of these stories, that of a London scientist whose long COVID made her so desperately fatigued that at times she was pretty much bedridden. She was also so brain fogged that she often couldn't function even when she could get out of bed. She told me about a seminar she went to in which she raised her hand to ask a question, and when she was called on a few moments later, she had no idea what it was she had meant to ask. She lived in a kind of terror that she was going to lose her job, and she fell into a deep depression. She tried 16/8 fasting, eating all of her food in 8 hours a day, but got no relief from that. Then she tried a fasting mimicking diet. A fasting mimicking diet is a diet that's very low in calories that mimics some of the effects of a fast, a little bit like the restricted diet of 800 calories that the wine dealer from Strasbourg ate during his stay at Buchinger-Wilhelmi. Only my scientist friend's diet was even smaller. It was about 500 to 600 calories a day. So she did this fasting mimicking diet for 5 days. Afterward, she found that she could walk around more and she could do a few other things that she'd previously been unable to do. She was still just extremely exhausted, but she was so encouraged that a week or two later, she tried a 48-hour fast on water only. Almost immediately, she noticed that she felt a little bit better. So she then did a second 48-hour water fast about a week or two later, and she was overjoyed to find that her fatigue evaporated and her depression lifted. Her brain fog also lessened a little bit, although it didn't disappear entirely. So she did a third and then a fourth 48-hour fast, each time separated by a week or so. And each time, she noticed more improvements. Finally, after a fifth fast, this one a little bit longer at about 60 hours, her brain fog entirely disappeared. For good, it would seem. She wrote me in an email. She said, quote, "I simply cannot describe in words my energy, excitement, and hope for the future. I'm back to running and cycling, and most importantly, I remember words, I can pay attention, I feel clever and confident. I feel like I have my young brain back." It's interesting that the 16/8 time-restricted eating didn't seem to help her, whereas it did apparently help the wine dealer from Strasbourg. It's also interesting that while other fasters benefited from prolonged fasts of a week or multiple weeks, she found relief with repeated short fasts of just a couple of days. To me, it's encouraging that different forms of fasting seem to yield success for different people. So, those are the 6 cases. I find them credible in part because they're consistent with other reversals of disease that fasting has brought about. But before I get to that, let me emphasize again that because these weren't clinical trials, we don't know for sure that it was fasting that reversed their disease. Something else that we're not noticing or can't even detect might have been the cause. That said, we do have good reason to believe their fasts were probably the cause of their healing. Why? Because we have a century of solid clinical observations from fasting doctors, and more recently, decades of impressive research by scientists at top institutions that together have shown, without doubt, that when we fast, we initiate a wide range of repair mechanisms inside the body. These repairs can patch up or replace damaged cells in virtually every part of the body, and as a result of these repairs, fasting can protect us from diseases that we don't yet have, and in many cases, can reverse diseases that we do have. Now, if you're not familiar with fasting, those statements may sound incredible or even crazy, but they're indisputably true. And actually, they really shouldn't surprise us because a basic fact of evolution is that virtually every complex organism, certainly including Homo sapiens, is a marvelous self-healing machine. See, our bodies are busy all the time making repairs to our cells to save us from disease. If our bodies didn't do that, not many of us would be here just a few years from now. But although we can and do repair ourselves, our bodies usually make these repairs only at a very low rate because most of the time they're busy doing all the other tasks that make up our lives. One of the biggest of these tasks is digesting our food each day, processing the nutrients from that food, and putting the nutrients to work in cells all over our bodies. But when we give our bodies a break from that immense labor, when we fast, our bodies take advantage of the rest to ramp up their cellular repairs. The results of these repairs are truly impressive. We have very good studies in scientific journals proving or strongly suggesting that fasting can reverse a wide range of diseases as varied as high blood pressure, childhood epilepsy, type 2 diabetes, and multiple autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis. We also have, as I mentioned, more than a century of consistent, credible clinical reports from fasting doctors and patients that suggest fasting can reverse asthma and allergies, osteoarthritis and fibromyalgia, schizophrenia, and other mental illnesses, enlarged prostate, impotence, irritable bowel syndrome, gallstones, and a very long list of other diseases. The reason that fasting can reverse such a variety of disease is that it's working on a systemic level. It's not inducing repairs in just one organ or in just one type of cell, but rather in almost every type of cell in every organ in the body. What are these repairs? Well, there are quite a lot of them, but let me tell you about just a handful that might be relevant to reversing the kind of damage that long COVID does. To start with, fasting increases the recycling of damaged and worn out parts inside our cells in a process called autophagy. See, our cells are these little exquisite engines, but like other engines, over time their parts show wear and tear. Our cells are forever repairing this wear and tear, but eventually some parts become too damaged to fix. If those damaged parts were just left there to malfunction, some of them would eventually cause us disease. To avoid that, a cell will break down a damaged part into its constituent components and then send those components onward to become the building blocks of fresh new parts. This recycling process, autophagy, increases remarkably when we fast, and researchers think the increase may play a big part in how fasting can reverse disease. Fasting can increase autophagy surprisingly quickly. There was a trial a few years ago of a kind of fasting called early time-restricted eating. In this trial, the volunteers ate in an early 6-hour window each day from about, say 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. And then they took nothing but water the other 18 hours of the day. During their eating window, they ate all their normal food. They didn't change a thing about what they ate or how much they ate. After just 4 days, their autophagy increased 22%. That is an astonishing improvement for just 4 days of changing only when, not what they ate. Fasting also greatly accelerates a process called apoptosis. Apoptosis is cellular suicide, which sounds bad, but isn't, or at least not always. Just as parts of our cells wear out over time and need to be replaced, entire cells also wear out. And when it becomes too much effort to keep repairing them, the body will kill them off to keep them from malfunctioning and causing disease. Apoptosis, like autophagy, happens all the time at a low rate, and it increases splendidly when we fast. And then when we're done fasting and we refeed, our stem cells, which are those special cells that give birth to other kind of cells, they become activated. and they produce healthy new cells that replace the damaged cells that were just killed off in apoptosis. You can think of the process as a kind of micro-level rejuvenation. Another mechanism that could be at work in the reversals of long COVID is that fasting calms down overactive immune systems that attack their own bodies. In rheumatoid arthritis, for example, fasting on water for a week has been shown to reduce the activity of neutrophils, which are white blood cells that ordinarily attack harmful bacteria, but in rheumatoid arthritis, they can turn on their own body and inflame the linings of joints. This and similar immune calming mechanisms probably explain why fasting has so much success against a long list of autoimmune diseases, from rheumatoid arthritis to psoriasis to ankylosing spondylitis, ulcerative colitis, and on and on. The immune calming effects of fasting might be relevant to many sufferers of long COVID, because one of the leading theories of what's behind some forms of long COVID is that the COVID virus has triggered an autoimmune response, in which the body, when it tried to get rid of the COVID, made a mistake and ended up attacking itself. Another possible mechanism in fasting's reversal of long COVID is the increase in antioxidants that we get when we fast. Antioxidants are these compounds that minimize the damage that our cells suffer from some of the many chemical reactions that they perform. When we fast, we get more antioxidants, which means less damage. Okay, this next mechanism remains a bit nebulous, I know, but we do know that prolonged fasting can restructure the gut microbiome, and this restructuring seems to improve our health. The gut microbiome is, of course, the couple of pounds of bacteria that we all carry around in our intestines all the time, and that scientists have recently discovered plays a potent role in our health. Unfortunately, that role is still poorly understood, but what we do know is that when we fast long enough, we wipe out most of our gut bacteria, both the good bacteria that help keep us healthy and the bad ones that help make us unhealthy. Now, what's so great about wiping out your whole microbiome, good and bad? What's great is that when you refeed, you can repopulate the biome with even more of the good bacteria, so long as you refeed healthily. And you do that by eating plants, which healthy bacteria love because healthy bacteria thrive on fiber, and only plants have fiber. The less processed the plants, the more the fiber. But if you refeed on animal products or highly processed junk, which is almost always low in fiber, the unhealthy bacteria, which love that crap, will repopulate your gut. Another mechanism potentially at play in reversing long COVID, or more like a set of mechanisms, is at work in the brain. As I've alluded to, brain fog is a very common problem with long COVID. Well, the good news is that fasting makes our brains healthier in several ways that scientists have just begun to study. For example, when we fast, we break down our fat stores for fuel, and one of the breakdown products, ketone bodies, stimulates the production of a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. BDNF helps us grow new neurons, and it helps us form new synapses between our existing neurons, which makes our brains work better. Scientists have a long way to go to tease out all the ways that fasting improves the human brain, but we do know from studies of other animals that fasting causes them to have sharper memory, higher cognitive function, meaning they learn better, quicker healing of brain traumas like concussions, less anxiety, better resistance to some of our worst neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. So is it really a surprise that people with long COVID are telling us that fasting cleared their brain fog? I don't think so. Fasting also improves neurological function beyond the brain. For example, when mice with multiple sclerosis are fasted, they have less nerve damage and better motor and mental function. In one study, 20% of mice saw their multiple sclerosis entirely reversed when they fasted. That's worth repeating. Fasting seems to have completely cured some of these mice of their MS, which till now has been considered an incurable disease. Finally, we also know that fasting improves multiple biomarkers that predict general health or illness. So people who fast tend to normalize their high blood sugar. They tend to lower their high cholesterol, and they almost always lower their high blood pressure. In fact, the largest drop in hypertension from any therapy ever reported in the peer-reviewed literature came not from pills, not from a conventional procedure, but from roughly 10 days of fasting on water at the True North Health Center. So, those are just some of the mechanisms that might enable fasting to reverse long COVID. The point here is that we have good evidence-based reasons to think it's at least possible that fasting could make biomechanical changes that could lessen or even eliminate long COVID. Unfortunately, you are not going to come across many doctors who agree. As I have found since writing my book, doctors are almost universally ignorant of the science and history of fasting. And I wish it were just a matter of ignorance, but there's also a profound bias in the medical profession against fasting. The fact is that although almost every doctor you meet will claim to practice evidence-based medicine, the vast majority of them simply refuse to look at the mountain of evidence that shows that fasting can prevent and reverse disease. One reason I wrote my book was to lay out that pile of evidence so that anyone, doctors included, who cared to look at the facts dispassionately could do so. But it's the rare doctor I've come across who will. So if you go to a doctor and ask if you should fast for long COVID, 99 out of 100 of them will tell you no. Now, I'm not here to say you should or shouldn't fast for your long COVID. I'm a reporter, not a doctor, and I don't give medical advice. My job, in this instance, is to report credible cases, if any exist, and I obviously think they do, and to explain the state of the science. It's up to each individual to decide what to do with that information. That said, for anyone who is considering fasting for long COVID, or for that matter, fasting for any other reason, another part of my job is passing on some general considerations about fasting, including safety considerations, which I've learned from fasting doctors and scientists, and which I think that every faster or potential faster would do well to know. The first of these is that fasting, when properly done, is one of the safest therapies available. It does, however, need to be done properly. And there are a lot of people you'll see online who are undertaking quite dangerous fasts. Now here it's important to know there are basically two kinds of fasting. One is daily fasting, which I mentioned earlier, often called time-restricted eating. That just means narrowing your eating window each day. Scientists and doctors who use this kind of fasting have concluded that with a few small cautions, just about any adult can safely do it at home on their own. The other kind of fasting is prolonged fasting, which is fasting for multiple days or weeks. Most fasting doctors recommend that prolonged fasting be done under the supervision of a doctor who is trained to oversee these longer fasts. This is especially true if you have an illness of any kind, including, of course, long COVID. If you want to know more about how to do daily fasting, and also why nearly every adult with or without long COVID would be healthier doing it, have a look at my video, The Science of When to Eat Each Day. It's on my YouTube channel, it's at my website, stevehendricks.org. I also give more detail, a whole chapter, in fact, in my book, The Oldest Cure in the World. The short story, though, is you just eat in a shorter window each day. The earlier the better, which means taking most of your calories in the morning and early afternoon. As for prolonged fasting, fasting for days or weeks, it's very safe when done under the supervision of a trained fasting doctor, but you want to avoid doing it unsupervised. That's because on a prolonged fast, your body is doing a lot of hard work, and someone knowledgeable needs to check through physical exams, blood tests, urine tests, that your organs are all up to the job. Although it's uncommon for things to go wrong on a fast, it does sometimes happen. If a doctor is checking you and finds something off, they'll make an adjustment, or even have you break your fast until your body recovers. But without a doctor checking you, you could fast your way into trouble, completely unaware that your fast is damaging your organs, which you may not find out until it's too late. Now and then, a few people have even died from unsupervised fasting. So prolonged fasting really shouldn't be taken lightly. Unfortunately, there aren't a ton of doctors trained to supervise fasts. For a short list, including a few who may, I think, supervise fasts remotely, go to the Frequently Asked Questions page at my website, which is, again, stevehendricks.org. I write about some of these doctors in my book with their various pros and cons. Please know I'm not employed by them, I don't receive a commission from them, and I don't endorse them. Although some of them, as you'll know if you read my book, certainly have my profound respect for the work that they have done. I want to close by saying that I put this talk together after first trying to get editors and producers at dozens of big newspapers, magazines, websites to run a story about fasting for long COVID. Unfortunately, even with credible cases from articulate patients who had been treated by respected doctor researchers, and even with several plausible mechanisms that scientists have shown are at work in fasting's reversal of other diseases, not one editor or producer would touch the piece, which I'm pretty sure they thought was just pure quackery. Their response, or non-response, is a sad commentary on where fasting stands in the minds of establishmentarians who have a long way to go before they can accept the radical idea that our bodies can often heal themselves. It's also a sad commentary on which scientific questions get researched in our system of profit-driven medicine. The way science should be advanced in a case like this is that a doctor or two notices that some therapy or other unexpectedly helps several of their patients. The doctors report these cases publicly, and if the cases seem promising, if, for example, there are known mechanisms that might explain why the patients got better, then some scientists will put the question to the test in clinical trials. And I have no doubt that is exactly what would have happened if a couple of doctors had stepped forward and said, you know, when we gave our long COVID patients the statin Lipitor and the antidepressant Prozac, their long COVID seemed to go away. Drug companies can make billions of dollars off findings like that. So there would have been plenty of interest from scientists and corporations, and clinical trials would be happening as I speak. And all that corporate interest would have translated into credibility with the media. So a lot of those editors who turned down my fasting pitch, they would now be running stories on the sparkling promise of this hot new drug therapy for long COVID. But it's a whole other story for a therapy like fasting, because you just can't make as much money off telling people not to eat as you can from selling them a drug. So fasting gets ignored. And the more it's ignored, the more it tends to be dismissed as quackery. That's a long way of saying that one reason I made this video is to try to nudge into life a discussion about fasting, a discussion that doctors and the media both refuse to have. Look, maybe fasting can reverse long COVID, as I obviously think is likely. Or maybe it can't, but it certainly merits investigating. Perhaps with enough nudges like this one, some scientist or other will decide it's a question worth testing. The answer to that question will no doubt be less financially enriching than chasing Big Pharma's latest moneymaker, but surely there's a scientist out there somewhere who thinks the possibility of finding a low-cost cure for long COVID would be vastly more enriching to the soul. Many thanks for watching. And again, there's more information about fasting at my website, stevehendricks.org, and of course, in my book, The Oldest Cure in the World.